We're going to quickly talk about what happens when we get the signal, how it's sent through, and then a little bit about response to a signal. Again, this is going to be very generic, but good to understand some of the generic mechanisms here. Again, we have this idea of signal transduction, relaying the message from the receptor into the cell, and then having some sort of response occur there. We'll talk about binding of ligands and how that changes and starts signal transduction. We'll look at phosphorylation, a key part of many of these mechanisms, and then we'll talk a little bit about how signaling can affect and direct protein expression, we call that gene expression, changes in metabolism, and cell growth. So here's an example pathway. This is not anything specific. We will come back to this a little bit later in cell division when we talk about cancer, but here's just an example. So this pathway is showing epidermal growth factor. We call that EGF in the diagram. And of course, there needs to be a receptor for that. So EGF is a small 53 amino acid peptide, and there is epidermal growth factor receptor, EGFR, which is embedded in the membrane. When EGFR, the receptor, binds the ligand, so the ligand's floating around and it binds to the receptor, this starts what we call a signaling cascade. So one thing affects another thing, which impacts another thing, which so on and so forth down the line leads to a response. In this case, we have a group of kinases. Kinases are proteins that phosphorylate other things. So here we have this MEK. MEK gets phosphorylated, and the phosphorylated MEK phosphorylates something else, which then sends this down the line. So we have this cascade of one thing affecting another thing, sending that signal down, which is going to, in this case, stimulate translation, the making of proteins, but it also stimulates cell proliferation, the growth and division of cells, cell migration and or adhesion, so moving and attaching to places. This process is called angiogenesis, where new blood vessels are grown. It also inhibits this process called apoptosis, which is the form of cell death. Cells can direct themselves to basically die to protect the organism or for various reasons. So if you want cells to divide and grow, you want to stop this process of apoptosis from occurring. This same ligand might have different effects in different cell types. So it's not just as simple as knowing the ligand and the receptor. We have to know what type of cell it's in, and it gets very complicated very, very quickly. Many of these signals are changing what we call gene expression. So signaling can alter how the DNA is transcribed into mRNA and how that is translated into a protein. That's effectively turning on or turning off genes. That can lead to all different kinds of outcomes. Changes in cell metabolism, using a different food source, for instance. Cell growth, cell division, even cell death. Like I said, apoptosis is that programmed cell death. So here we have, in this case, an mRNA that can't be translated, and then we have a signaling molecule come in and allow this to be synthesized into a protein. So that's one example here. So I've talked about this apoptosis process several times. We'll talk about it a little bit more in cancer, and if you study the immune system, apoptosis is important. Cells that basically realize they're infected with viruses and things like that can undergo apoptosis. But apoptosis is actually a critical part of development. Developmental biology is one of my favorite things. It's so cool how we go from a single cell to all these complicated different cell types and tissues and structures and things like that. I highly recommend taking a development class somewhere along your journey through biology. One of the cool things about development is if you ever look at mammals developing, their embryos all look very, very similar. So when you're developing, you have webbed feet and webbed hands. And that looks very similar to other mammals or even things like frogs and stuff like that. But during our development, this process called apoptosis kicks on, and we actually start to kill some of those cells that are causing the webbing, which leads to our independent digits there. So through apoptosis, we're seeing cell death that leads to the individual fingers or toes developing in there by basically killing the webbing cells that are in there. So we had this pathway here, and then we evolved a mechanism to destroy some of those cells to lead to a new development there. I think that's pretty freaking cool. And this process of apoptosis is really critical in development there. Okay, short and sweet there. We have ligands that can bind to receptors. That's often triggering some sort of signaling cascade. One thing affects another and another and another down the line. These signaling cascades are going to lead to changes in gene expression. That could be changes in transcription, taking DNA and making mRNA out of it, or translation, taking the mRNA and turning that into a protein. That could lead to many different outcomes, changes in metabolism, cell growth, cell division, or even cell death, apoptosis there. All right, that's it for our short little chapter 9. We'll move into chapter 10 next.